Lucy was 7 years old when everything changed. She had been living a simple, happy life with just her mom, Rebecca. They weren't rich, but they had each other. Rebecca worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, but she always made time for bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. Lucy felt safe and loved in their small apartment. That was before Rebecca met him. At first, Lucy didn't understand why her mom was so excited about this new man. His name was Robert, and he wore expensive suits and drove a shiny black car. When he came to pick up Rebecca for their dates, he would ruffle Lucy's hair and call her kiddo in a voice that sounded friendly enough. Rebecca would light up whenever he was around, smiling in a way Lucy hadn't seen since before her real father left. Rebecca had been alone for so long, working endless hours just to keep them afloat. When Robert came into their lives, he seemed like an answer to her prayers. He had money, stability, and he said all the right things about wanting to take care of both of them. After 6 months of dating, he proposed, and Rebecca said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small and quick. Lucy wore a white dress with pink flowers that Robert had bought for her, and she tried to smile as she watched her mom exchange vows. Something deep in her stomach felt wrong, but she pushed the feeling away. Her mom looked so happy, and Lucy wanted her to stay that way. The first few weeks after the wedding seemed normal enough. Robert moved into their apartment, which suddenly felt much smaller. He brought his own furniture, his own rules, and his own way of doing things. Lucy noticed that her mom started asking her to be quieter, to put her toys away faster, to be more careful about making messes. The changes started small. Robert didn't like it when Lucy left her backpack by the front door. He said it looked messy and made the place seem like a daycare center. So Lucy learned to take her backpack straight to her room. Then he didn't like the way she chewed her cereal in the morning. The sound bothered him, he said. It was disgusting and showed bad manners. Lucy tried to chew more quietly, but somehow she could never get it right. Robert would look at her across the breakfast table with this expression of annoyance and disappointment that made her stomach twist into knots. Her mom would give her worried looks and whisper reminders about using better table manners. As the months went by, Robert's complaints grew longer and louder. Lucy was too loud when she played. She was too messy when she ate. She asked too many questions. She watched too much television. She read too many books and left them scattered around. Everything she did seemed to irritate him. The worst part was watching what happened to her mom. Rebecca, who used to laugh and sing while cooking dinner, became quiet and nervous. She started apologizing for things that weren't even problems before. If Lucy spilled something or forgot to hang up her jacket, Rebecca would rush to fix it before Robert noticed, her hands shaking slightly as she cleaned up. Lucy began to feel like she was walking on eggshells in her own home. She learned to move quietly through the apartment, to eat without making any sound, to play with her toys in complete silence. But no matter how careful she was, Robert always found something wrong. One evening, when Lucy was 8, she accidentally knocked over a glass of water while reaching for the salt at dinner. The glass shattered on the kitchen floor, and water spread everywhere. It was an accident, the kind of thing that happens to kids all the time. Before, her mom would have laughed it off and helped her clean up while reminding her to be more careful, but Robert exploded. His face turned red, and his voice filled the small kitchen as he shouted about how clumsy and careless Lucy was. He said she never paid attention, never learned from her mistakes, and that she was becoming more problematic every day. Rebecca tried to calm him down, but he turned his anger on her too, asking why she couldn't teach her daughter basic coordination and respect for other people's property. That night, Lucy heard her mom crying in the bedroom. She pressed her ear to the wall and listened to Robert's voice, lower now but still angry, talking about how difficult Lucy was becoming and how her behavior was affecting their marriage. Lucy heard her mom defending her, but weakly, as if she wasn't sure she believed her own words anymore. From that night on, Lucy noticed her mom looking at her differently. Not with the unconditional love she was used to, but with worry and frustration. Rebecca started correcting Lucy more often, reminding her to be careful. To think before she acted, to consider how her behavior affected others in the house. Robert was clever about his cruelty. He never hit Lucy or screamed at her when other people were around. To the outside world, he appeared to be a devoted stepfather who had generously taken on the responsibility of raising another man's child. At school events or family gatherings, he would put his hand on Lucy's shoulder and talk about how proud he was of her, how much he loved being her stepdad. But at home, behind closed doors, he chipped away at her confidence piece by piece. He told her that her real father had left because she was too much trouble to handle. He said that her mom would be happier and less stressed if Lucy weren't around. He convinced her that every problem in their household was somehow her fault. When Lucy turned 9, Robert's psychological tactics became more sophisticated. He would hide her favorite toys and then act concerned when she couldn't find them, suggesting that she was becoming forgetful and irresponsible. He would change plans at the last minute and then blame Lucy for being disappointed, saying she was ungrateful and demanding. The most devastating thing he did was turn her mother against her, slowly and systematically. He would point out every small mistake Lucy made, every normal childhood behavior, and frame it as evidence that she was becoming uncontrollable. He talked to Rebecca about how worried he was about Lucy's future, how her attitude problems would hold her back in life if they didn't address them now. Rebecca, exhausted from walking on eggshells herself and desperate to keep her marriage together, began to believe him. She started seeing Lucy's normal childhood behaviors through Robert's critical lens. When Lucy laughed too loudly or forgot to put her dishes in the sink, Rebecca would sigh and look disappointed in a way that cut deeper than any punishment could have. By the time Lucy was 10, she had learned to expect nothing good for herself. She stopped asking for things she wanted, stopped sharing exciting news from school, stopped hoping that things might get better. She made herself as small and invisible as possible, trying desperately to avoid Robert's attention and criticism. The little girl who had once been curious and talkative became quiet and withdrawn. She learned that speaking up only brought trouble, that showing excitement or joy would somehow be used against her later. She began to believe, deep in her heart, that she really was the problem. Robert said she was. Lucy's 10th birthday came and went with barely any acknowledgement. Robert said that big celebrations would only encourage her to think she was special, which would make her more difficult to handle. Rebecca gave her a small gift privately, but even that felt hollow and sad compared to the joyful birthdays they used to celebrate together. As Lucy lay in her bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of her mom and Robert talking in the next room, she realized that the happy little girl she used to be was disappearing. In her place was someone quiet and scared, someone who expected nothing and asked for even less. She didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The damage being done to her young heart would follow her for years to come, shaping how she saw herself and what she believed she deserved from life. Robert was systematically destroying her sense of self-worth, and there seemed to be no one left to protect her from his cruelty. The teenage years were supposed to be about discovering who you are, making friends, and having fun. For Lucy, they became about survival and staying invisible. By the time she turned 30, she had perfected the art of disappearing into the background of her own life. At school, Lucy was the quiet girl who sat in the back of the classroom. She did her homework perfectly, never caused trouble, and answered questions only when directly asked. Her teachers thought she was simply shy, maybe a little reserved. They had no idea that at home she was walking through a minefield every single day. Robert's control over their household had grown stronger over the years. He decided what they watched on television, what food Rebecca could buy at the grocery store, and how Lucy should spend her free time. He said these decisions were for their own good, that he was trying to build character and teach responsibility. But Lucy could see how these rules were really about making sure he had power over every aspect of their lives. The worst part was watching her mom change completely. Rebecca, who used to be strong and independent, had become a shadow of herself. She asked Robert's permission before making any decisions, even small ones like what to cook for dinner or whether Lucy could stay after school for a club activity. Rebecca had learned, just like Lucy, that disagreeing with Robert brought consequences that weren't worth the fight. Lucy tried to find ways to cope with the constant tension at home. She discovered that the school library was a safe place where she could disappear for hours. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, was kind and never asked too many questions about why Lucy spent so much time there. Among the books, Lucy found stories of people who had overcome difficult situations, characters who had found strength in dark times. Reading became her escape. She would lose herself in stories about brave heroes and happy endings, imagining what it would be like to live in a world where good things happened to people who deserve them. Sometimes she would stay in the library until it closed, dreading the moment she had to go home and face whatever mood Robert was in that day. At home, Lucy had learned to read the signs of Robert's temper like a weather forecast. She could tell by the way he closed the front door whether he'd had a good day or bad day at work. She knew by the tone of his voice when he said hello whether she should make herself scarce or if it was safe to be in the same room. This constant state of alertness was exhausting, but it had become her normal way of living. Robert's punishments had become more creative and cruel as Lucy got older. He no longer just criticized her behavior. He attacked her dreams and hopes. When Lucy mentioned wanting to try out for the school play, he laughed and said she didn't have the personality for performing. When she showed interest in art class, he told her that creative pursuits were a waste of time for someone who needed to focus on practical skills. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Robert had gradually cut Lucy off from any potential support systems. He convinced Rebecca that sleepovers were inappropriate and that after-school activities were a waste of money. He said that Lucy needed to focus on her responsibilities at home rather than socializing with friends who might be a bad influence. Lucy learned not to bring friends home because Robert would find ways to embarrass her or make them feel unwelcome. The few times she had tried, he would interrogate her friends about their families, their grades, and their plans for the future in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Eventually, Lucy stopped trying to maintain friendships at all. It was easier to be alone than to risk the humiliation of Robert. Driving away anyone who might care about her. High school brought new challenges. While other teenagers were worried about dating, college applications, and figuring out their future, Lucy was focused on surviving each day without setting off Robert's anger. She had become an expert at anticipating his needs and avoiding his triggers. But this constant vigilance left her exhausted and anxious. Rebecca had become Robert's ally in controlling Lucy's life. Though Lucy could see that her mom was as trapped as she was, Rebecca would enforce Robert's rules and back up his decisions. But sometimes Lucy caught her looking sad and confused, as if she couldn't quite remember how they had all ended up living this way. The few times Lucy tried to talk to her mom about how she felt, Rebecca would get nervous and defensive. She would remind Lucy that Robert was providing for them, that he was trying to help Lucy become a better person, and that Lucy should be grateful for his guidance. These conversations always ended with Lucy feeling more alone than before. As Lucy approached her 16th birthday, she began to realize that other families didn't live the way theirs did. She would hear classmates talking about their parents in ways that seemed foreign to her. They spoke about parents who supported their dreams, who celebrated their achievements, who seemed to actually enjoy spending time with their children. Lucy started to understand that the way Robert treated her wasn't normal, but she felt powerless to change anything. She was still a minor, financially dependent on him, and her own mother seemed to have chosen his side. The idea of speaking up or asking for help felt impossible and dangerous. Instead, Lucy threw herself into her schoolwork with even more intensity. She discovered that academic achievement was something Robert couldn't easily criticize. When she brought home perfect grades, he would grudgingly acknowledge her success, though he always found ways to diminish it by saying it was the least she could do given all the advantages he was providing her. Lucy began to see education as her ticket out of this life. She started researching colleges and scholarships, dreaming of a future where she could live somewhere else, make her own decisions, and maybe even figure out who she really was underneath all the fear and self-doubt that Robert had built into her. The planning had to be done in secret. Lucy would use the school's computer lab to research colleges and fill out applications. She hid acceptance letters and scholarship information in her school locker, afraid that Robert would find them and find ways to sabotage her plans. She had learned not to trust him with anything that mattered to her. By her senior year, Lucy had become a master of living a double life. At school, she was the quiet, studious girl who never caused problems. At home, she was the obedient stepdaughter, who followed every rule and tried to stay out of the way. But inside, she was nurturing a small flame of hope that someday things would be different. The college acceptance letters started arriving in the spring. Lucy had applied to schools far enough away that she couldn't easily come home every weekend, but not so far that it would seem suspicious. She had chosen schools that offered good financial aid packages, because she knew she would be on her own financially. When Lucy finally told Rebecca and Robert about her college plans, the reaction was explosive. Robert accused her of being ungrateful and selfish, of abandoning the family that had sacrificed so much for her. He said that college would fill her head with ideas that would make her even more difficult to deal with. Rebecca looked torn between pride in her daughter's achievements and fear of Robert's disapproval. But for once in her life, Lucy stood her ground. She had spent years planning this escape, and she wasn't going to let Robert take it away from her. She would leave for college in the fall, carrying with her years of damage that she didn't yet fully understand, but also a determination to build a different kind of life for herself. The day she left for college, Lucy looked back at the house where she had spent her teenage years learning to expect nothing good for herself. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. College was supposed to be freedom, but for Lucy, it felt like stepping into a world where she didn't know the rules. At 18-ish, she arrived at campus with one suitcase, a partial scholarship, and a heart full of wounds she didn't even realize were still bleeding. The first week was overwhelming in ways she hadn't expected. Her roommate, Jenny, was friendly and outgoing, the kind of person who made friends easily and filled their dorm room with laughter and music. Jenny would invite Lucy to join study groups, go to parties, or just hang out in the common room. But Lucy found herself making excuses, retreating to the library or pretending to be asleep when Jenny brought friends over. The problem wasn't that Lucy didn't want friends. Deep down, she craved connection and belonging. But years of Robert's conditioning had taught her that getting close to people was dangerous. She expected criticism, rejection, and disappointment around every corner. It was easier to stay alone than to risk confirming what Robert had always told her, that she was fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love. Simple social interactions that came naturally to other students felt like complex puzzles to Lucy when classmates complimented her on a presentation. She assumed they were being polite or sarcastic. When professors praised her work, she worried they would change their minds once they got to know her better. The voice in her head, which sounded remarkably like Robert's, constantly reminded her not to get too comfortable or confident. Money was a constant source of stress. Lucy worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore and picked up extra shifts whenever possible. She sent home regular updates to her mother about her grades and activities, but communication with Robert was minimal and tense. He made it clear that he considered her college education an expensive waste of time, and that she shouldn't expect any financial help from home. Lucy learned to survive on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. She bought used textbooks and wore the same clothes until they fell apart. While other students complained about dining hall food or asked their parents for money for new clothes, Lucy felt grateful for every small thing she could afford. The poverty didn't bother her as much as the constant anxiety about whether she could make it through each semester financially. Dating was a disaster. Lucy's first boyfriend, Tyler, was attracted to her quiet, mysterious nature, but when he tried to get closer, Lucy panicked. She didn't know how to accept affection without waiting for the catch, the criticism, or the moment when he would reveal his true opinion of her. Tyler was a decent guy, but Lucy's constant need for reassurance and her inability to believe his compliments eventually wore him down. Her second attempt at romance was even worse. She found herself attracted to Brandon, a guy who was moody and unpredictable. Something about his criticism and emotional distance felt familiar, even comfortable. When Brandon would ignore her calls or make harsh comments about her appearance, Lucy accepted it as normal behavior. She didn't realize she was recreating the same dynamic she had lived with at home. The relationship with Brandon lasted 8 months and left Lucy feeling more broken than before. He would build her up one day and tear her down the next, and Lucy spent all her energy trying to figure out what she had done wrong. When he finally broke up with her, citing her neediness and emotional problems, Lucy felt like it confirmed everything Robert had ever said about her. After that, Lucy decided relationships weren't worth the pain. She focused entirely on her studies and work, building walls around her heart that felt safer than vulnerability. She excelled in her classes, particularly in psychology and social work courses, though she didn't yet understand why she was drawn to understanding human behavior and trauma. The summer between her sophomore and junior years, Lucy stayed on campus and worked full-time at a local restaurant. She couldn't afford to go home, and honestly, she didn't want to. The few phone calls with her mother were awkward and brief. Rebecca sounded tired and distant, and Lucy could hear Robert's voice in the background, reminding her that long distance calls were expensive. During that summer, Lucy had her first real moment of clarity about her childhood. She was reading a psychology textbook for an upcoming class when she came across a chapter on emotional abuse and its long-term effects. As she read the descriptions of manipulation, isolation, and systematic destruction of self-worth, she felt like someone had written her life story. For the first time, Lucy had words for what had happened to her. She wasn't crazy or fundamentally flawed. She had been abused. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that Robert's treatment of her hadn't been her fault, but it also meant she had to face years of damage that she had been trying to ignore. Lucy threw herself into learning about trauma and recovery. She read every book she could find about childhood emotional abuse, family dysfunction, and healing. The more she learned, the more she understood about her own patterns and behaviors. She began to see how Robert's voice had become the voice in her own head, constantly criticizing and undermining her, but understanding the problem and fixing it were two different things. Lucy still flinched when people raised their voices. She still apologized constantly for things that weren't her fault. She still expected people to abandon her or turn against her without warning. Knowledge was the first step, but it didn't immediately erase years of conditioning. Junior year brought new challenges. Lucy decided to major in social work, driven by a desire to help other people who had experienced trauma. Her professors noticed her insight and dedication, but they also recognized signs of someone who was still struggling with her own wounds. One professor, Dr. Martinez, gently suggested that Lucy might benefit from counseling services. The idea of therapy terrified Lucy. Talking about her feelings and experiences felt dangerous, like exposing herself to more potential criticism and judgment. But something about Dr. Martinez's kind suggestion stuck with her. Maybe it was time to stop trying to heal alone. Lucy's first therapy session was awkward and uncomfortable. The counselor, Miss Thompson, was patient and gentle, but Lucy found it almost impossible to open up. She had spent years keeping her thoughts and feelings locked away, and she didn't know how to let them out safely. The sessions felt like learning a new language, the language of emotional honesty. Slowly, very slowly, Lucy began to make progress. She learned that healing wasn't a straight line, that she would have good days and bad days, and that recovery was possible even when it felt impossible. She started to recognize Robert's voice in her head and challenged the cruel things it told her. She began to see that the scared, damaged little girl inside her deserved compassion, not criticism. By her senior year, Lucy had started to build a different kind of life. She had a few close friends who knew about her background and accepted her completely. She was doing well in her classes and had been accepted to graduate school. Most importantly, she was beginning to believe that she might actually deserve good things. The day Lucy graduated from college, she looked out at the audience and realized that Robert and Rebecca weren't there. She had stopped expecting them to show up for important moments in her life, but it still hurt. However, she also saw her chosen family, friends who had become like siblings, professors who had believed in her, and people who had shown her what healthy relationships looked like. As Lucy walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pride in herself. She had survived her childhood, put herself through college, and was building a career. Helping others? She still had work to do on healing her own heart, but for the first time, she believed it was possible. The little girl who had been told she was worthless and unlovable was growing into a woman who was starting to see her own strength and value. The journey was far from over, but Lucy was finally moving in the right direction. At 26, Lucy had built what she thought was a perfect life. She had her own small apartment near the coast, a steady job at a nonprofit organization that helped at-risk youth, and a routine that felt safe and predictable. She woke up at the same time every morning, had her coffee black, and drove to work listening to the same news station. Her life was quiet, organized, and completely under her control. The nonprofit where Lucy worked was called Hope Harbor, and it provided counseling and support services to children and teenagers who had experienced trauma. Lucy was good at her job, maybe too good. She could spot the signs of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction from across the room. Her colleagues respected her insight and dedication, though they sometimes worried that she worked too many hours and never seemed to take time for herself. Lucy told herself she preferred being alone. Relationships were messy and unpredictable, and she had learned that people eventually disappointed you or found reasons to leave. Her apartment was exactly the way she liked it. Books organized by author, dishes always clean, everything in its proper place. She had 2 friends from college who called occasionally, but she rarely accepted their invitations to visit or go out. Then Michael walked into her office, and everything changed. Michael Torres was 41 years old and looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, had been having problems at school ever since her mother died from cancer the year before. The little girl's grades were dropping, she was getting into fights with classmates, and her teacher was worried that she wasn't processing her grief in healthy ways. Michael had heard about Hope Harbor from Isabella's school counselor. He was desperate to help his daughter, but he felt completely lost. As a single father trying to balance his job as a high school history teacher with raising a grieving child, he was overwhelmed and exhausted. He had no idea how to help Isabella deal with emotions that he was barely managing himself. Lucy's first meeting with Michael was purely professional. She sat across from him in her office, taking notes as he described Isabella's behavior and his concerns. She found herself impressed by how much he genuinely cared about his daughter's well-being. Unlike many parents who came to Hope Harbor looking for quick fixes, Michael was willing to do whatever it took to help Isabella heal. Michael was different from other fathers Lucy had worked with. He didn't make excuses for his daughter's behavior or blame her teachers for not understanding her situation. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about grief counseling and took careful notes about Lucy's suggestions. He wanted to understand not just what to do, but why certain approaches would help Isabella feel safer and more supported. During their second meeting, Lucy learned more about their story. Michael's wife, Elena, had been diagnosed with cancer. When Isabella was 6, they had fought the disease for 2 years, believing until the very end that she would recover. When Elena died suddenly from complications, both Michael and Isabella were unprepared for the devastating loss. Michael described how different Isabella had been before her mother's death. She had been outgoing and confident, the kind of child who made friends easily and filled their house with laughter. After Elena died, Isabella became withdrawn and angry. She refused to talk about her mother and seemed determined to push away anyone who tried to get close to her. Lucy found herself thinking about Michael and Isabella even after work hours. There was something about Michael's quiet strength and obvious love for his daughter that touched something deep inside her. She had worked with many families over the years, but she had never felt this personally invested in helping someone heal. The breakthrough came during Isabella's 3rd counseling session. Lucy had been working with the little girl using art therapy, encouraging her to draw pictures about her feelings. For weeks, Isabella had drawn dark, angry scribbles or refused to draw anything at all. But that day she drew a picture of 3 stick figures holding hands, herself, her father, and her mother. When Isabella started crying while explaining her drawing, Lucy felt her own eyes fill with tears. She saw herself in this little girl. The confusion, the anger, the desperate need for someone to understand her pain. But she also saw something she had never had at Isabella's age. A parent who was fighting to help her heal instead of making her feel worse. Michael began staying for Isabella's sessions, wanting to understand how he could better support her at home. Lucy noticed how carefully he listened to her suggestions and how thoughtfully he implemented them. When she recommended family activities that might help Isabella express her grief, Michael didn't just nod politely, he actually did them. When she suggested books about helping children cope with loss, he read every single one. Over the months that followed, Isabella slowly began to improve. She started talking about her mother in therapy sessions, sharing happy memories alongside her sadness. Her grades at school began to stabilize, and she made a new friend in her class. Most importantly, she started letting her father comfort her when she was sad instead of pushing him away. But Lucy noticed that as Isabella healed, Michael seemed to be struggling more. He was losing weight, working longer hours, and often seemed distracted during their meetings. One day, after Isabella had gone to play in the waiting room, Lucy gently asked Michael how he was handling his own grief. Michael was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he had been so focused on helping Isabella that he hadn't really dealt with his own loss. He missed Elena desperately, felt guilty about moving forward without her, and worried constantly that he wasn't enough for Isabella on his own. He had been the strong one for so long that he had forgotten how to ask for help with his own pain. Lucy found herself wanting to help Michael in ways that went beyond her professional responsibilities. She recommended a grief support group for widowed parents and gave him resources about self-care and managing stress. But more than that, she found herself genuinely caring about his well-being as a person. Not just as Isabella's father. The moment Lucy realized her feelings had crossed professional boundaries was during a community event at the local park. Hope Harbor had organized a family fun day, and many of their clients attended with their children. Lucy was volunteering at the face painting booth when she saw Michael and Isabella walking toward her. Isabella ran up to Lucy with excitement, asking for a butterfly painted on her cheek. As Lucy carefully applied the colorful design, she was aware of Michael watching them with a gentle smile. When Isabella ran off to show her father her new butterfly, Michael lingered at the booth. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for today, but for everything you've done for her." For us, Lucy felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be part of a family, to matter to people who would choose to keep her in their lives. As summer turned to fall, Lucy realized that her weekly meetings with Michael and Isabella had become the highlight of her carefully structured life. She looked forward to Isabella's progress reports and Michael's thoughtful questions. She found herself thinking about them on weekends and hoping they were having good days, but Lucy was terrified of these new feelings. Everything she had learned about relationships told her that caring this much was dangerous. People left, people disappointed you, and people eventually saw through whatever good qualities you thought you had. The smart thing to do would be to maintain professional distance and transfer Isabella's case to another counselor. But for the first time in her adult life, Lucy found herself wanting to take a risk on connection. Maybe, just maybe, some people were worth the chance of getting hurt. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Hope Harbor was hosting its annual fundraising dinner at the community center, and Lucy had volunteered to help with the setup. The event was meant to bring together families, donors, and community members to celebrate the organization's work with at-risk youth. Lucy had been looking forward to seeing Michael and Isabella there, though she tried to convince herself it was just professional interest. Isabella had been making remarkable progress in therapy, and Lucy wanted to celebrate this milestone with them. But deep down, she knew her feelings had grown far beyond anything professional. The evening started perfectly. Isabella wore a new dress that Michael had bought specially for the occasion, and she beamed with pride as she introduced Lucy to her teacher as, "My friend who helps me feel better." Michael looked more relaxed than Lucy had seen him in months, and he thanked her again for everything she had done for their family. But around 8 o'clock, a sudden thunderstorm hit the area. The lights in the community center flickered, and the sound of thunder rolled across the sky like an explosion. For most people, it was just weather. For Lucy, it was a trigger that sent her spiraling back 20 years. The loud, sudden noise brought back memories of Robert's explosive anger. The way his voice would fill their small apartment when he was furious about something Lucy had done wrong. The sound of thunder mixed with the memory of slamming doors, shouting voices, and the feeling of being small and helpless while the adults in her life raged around her. Lucy felt her chest tighten and her breathing become shallow. Panic washed over her in waves, and she knew she needed to get away from the crowd before she completely fell apart. She slipped out of the main hall and found a small storage room, where she could hide until the storm passed and she could get control of herself again. But the panic attack was worse than usual. Lucy found herself curled up on the floor behind some folding chairs, shaking and gasping for air. Her heart was racing so fast she thought she might pass out. The rational part of her mind knew she was safe, but her body was reacting as if Robert was about to walk through the door and start screaming at her. That's where Michael found her. He had noticed when Lucy suddenly disappeared from the event and had quietly excused himself to look for her. When he found her in the storage room, clearly in distress, he didn't ask questions or demand explanations. Instead, he simply sat down on the floor beside her and spoke in the same gentle voice he used when Isabella had nightmares. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Whatever you're remembering, it's in the past. You're here with me and you're safe." Michael stayed with Lucy until her breathing returned to normal and the shaking stopped. He didn't try to make her talk about what had happened, and he didn't make her feel embarrassed about having a panic attack. He just sat there, steady and calm, until the storm inside her head passed along with the storm outside. When Lucy finally felt ready to speak, she found herself telling Michael things she had never told anyone. She talked about Robert and the years of emotional abuse that had taught her to expect danger around every corner. She explained how loud, sudden noises still triggered memories of his explosive anger and how she had learned to hide her fear so well that most people never realized. She was struggling. Michael listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions, but mostly just being present while Lucy shared the story she had kept locked inside for so long. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been to live through that, especially as a child. But I want you to know that you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." That night changed everything between them. As Michael walked Lucy to her car after the event, he asked if she would like to have coffee with him sometime, not as Isabella's counselor, but as someone he cared about. Lucy's first instinct was to say no, to protect herself from the risk of getting hurt. But something about the way Michael had sat with her in that storage room, accepting her panic and her past without trying to fix or judge her, made her feel brave enough to say yes. Their first official date was awkward and wonderful. They went to a small cafe near the harbor, and Lucy found herself talking more than she had in years. Michael told her about his life with Elena, how they had met in college and built a happy marriage before cancer took her away. He spoke about Elena with love, but without the desperate sadness that had marked his earlier grief. Lucy realized that Michael understood loss in a way that most people didn't. He knew what it felt like to have your world shattered and to rebuild it piece by piece. But unlike Lucy, who had learned to expect more pain, Michael had learned that love was worth the risk of loss. The relationship developed slowly, carefully. Lucy was terrified of making herself vulnerable, and Michael was patient with her fears. When she pulled away after particularly good days together, convinced that she was getting too attached and would inevitably be hurt, Michael didn't chase. her or demand explanations. He simply waited, showing up consistently and proving through his actions that he wasn't going anywhere. Isabella became an unexpected ally in Lucy's healing journey. The little girl, who had her own experience with loss and fear, seemed to understand that Lucy needed extra gentleness. Isabella would include Lucy in her drawings of family and ask Michael if Lucy could come to her school events. Her innocent acceptance helped Lucy see herself through the eyes of someone who had no preconceived notions about her worth. The breakthrough came 6 months after they started dating. Lucy was having dinner at Michael and Isabella's house when Isabella had a meltdown about a school project. Instead of the patient, professional response Lucy would normally give, she found herself reacting like a family member who genuinely cared about this child's well-being. She sat on the floor with Isabella, helped her work through her frustration, and stayed until the little girl felt better. It wasn't therapy, it was love. And as Lucy tucked Isabella into bed that night, reading her a story and listening to her prayers, she realized she had found something she had never expected, a family that chose her. Michael proposed on a quiet Sunday morning while they were making breakfast together. Isabella was at a sleepover, and the house was peaceful and full of sunlight. He didn't make a big speech or plan an elaborate proposal. He simply told Lucy that he loved her completely, that she had helped heal both him and Isabella, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life showing her how much she was worth. Lucy's first instinct was to panic, to list all the reasons why marriage was a bad idea and why she would inevitably disappoint him. But then she looked at this man who had seen her at her most broken and vulnerable and had chosen to love her anyway, and she found herself saying yes. They married a year later in a small ceremony at the harbor where they had first realized they loved each other. Isabella was Lucy's maid of honor, proud to officially become her stepdaughter. Lucy's mother attended the wedding, though their relationship remained complicated. Robert wasn't invited, and Lucy felt no sadness about his absence. As Lucy stood next to Michael, promising to love and cherish him for the rest of their lives, she thought about the scared little girl she used to be. That child could never have imagined that someday she would be surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, who chose her every day, and who saw her as worthy of happiness. The nonprofit where Lucy worked continued to thrive under her leadership, and she specialized in helping children who had experienced family trauma. Her own healing journey made her an even better advocate for the kids who needed someone to believe in their worth. Michael supported her work while building a stable, loving home for their blended family. 2 years after their wedding, Lucy and Michael welcomed a son, Daniel. As Lucy held her baby boy for the first time, she marveled at how different his life would be from hers. He would grow up knowing he was loved unconditionally, that his voice mattered, and that he deserved all the good things life had to offer. Lucy never spoke to Robert again, and she was at peace with that decision. She had learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to love and be loved. The little girl who had been shattered so many years ago had finally been put back together, not by forgetting her past, but by finding people who loved her, including her scars. In the end, Robert had been wrong about everything. Lucy wasn't worthless or unlovable. She wasn't the problem in every relationship. She was simply a person who had been hurt and needed time to heal. And with patience, love, and her own fierce determination, she had rewritten the story of her life into something beautiful.